Hello, I'm Mark White, and this is Coffee Talk.
We're here as usual with our assistant chair, Cheryl Bailey. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, how you doing there?
I'm doing all
Stand
right.
applause.
And we've got Ian Steed, our senior coordinator, with us as usual.
Hey, y'all.
Ian.
Hey, Ian. And today, you've already heard his voice in the background there. We've got as our guest Professor Mark White on the guitar faculty. Hey, Mark.
Hey, guys. Great
Great
to
to
be
see.
with you today.
Great to see you. So, Mark,
Yeah,
I know from knowing you that you are a food and coffee connoisseur.
it's the
So
truth.
it's really true. I mean, we could do a whole show. Someday we may do a culinary show, but could you share with everybody how you take your coffee?
I prefer Italian coffees, and I get my beans directly from Florence, Italy. They're a roaster called Manarese, and they're in Florence, aka there's other names. Most Americans know Firenze is being Florence, but I love their coffee. I'll also drink another one called Danese that's from Rome, but I like Arabica type of coffee, and the Manarese that I prefer is a 92 to 8% blend of all Arabica, and some people say Arabica. So Arabica, tomato, potato, Arabica, Arabiata, whatever, man. It's from Florence. It's a great coffee. I grind it super fine, almost like Turkish kind of grind, like getting really close to the 00, man. And then I pack it up and I espress it through La Pavoni lever piston coffee machines, which is my preferred weapon of choice when it comes to coffee making.
I love this.
Yeah.
So the first thing I'm going to remind you is you have to talk about this with our dean Ron Savage, who was on Coffee Talk and mentioned that he never drinks coffee in the United States because he got so enamored with Italian coffee. And now
Yeah.
you could share with him that there is a way.
Oh,
There is a way to bring it home.
I'll definitely have to bring that out because I need to talk to him anyway. So I think I'm going to bring up the coffee thing.
I think
But
that's perfect. Yeah.
I love these old, like I love mechanical things. I mean, you'll notice in my studio, Cheryl and I were just talking that I really like hardware. I mean, I use a lot of plugins in the mastering that I do and various different recording aspects, but I love classic hardware that is restored and, brought back to life and to spec. And as opposed to, recording with software plugins that emulate a quality. I love the hardware of like these silver Ampexes that are behind me. Those are old tape recorder pre's that have been converted to preamps, and it's a beautiful thing. It just I love the tactile sense of putting a great ribbon microphone through that RCA Op 6 that's next to that, and just you get 90 dB a gain out of those old machines. I mean, those guys were building this incredible stuff. So I mean, it's a little bit difficult to find, and you have to have it rebuilt or know how to rebuild it. But that's what I do, and that's what I do with my coffee. The La Pavoni lever machine is just, it's a superior thing where you control the flow and the darkness of the coffee that you make via the grind and how you operate the lever. So, I mean, you're pulling it down and controlling like the thickness and how long the hot water is in contact with the coffee. So it's a really kind of individual thing. It can be a little bit different, but once you get it together, I mean, it's very uniform, and it's just my favorite stuff. And the Manarese coffee from Florence, that's one of my favorite cities. Every time I'm in Italy, I always go to Florence, and that's pretty frequently. So, or used to be anyway. but maybe again soon,
Yeah,
because there's good things happening, folks.
that's right.
You
That's
know,
right. I love this because we started by asking everyone about their coffee, really, because the whole premise of the podcast was that when we get to be together, we hang out around the coffee machine as much as we can, or we go get coffee together and hang out. And that's just kind of been guitars and coffee. That's how we hang. And what we've seen over and over again, what we've heard from y'all is how much the way you approach your coffee has to do with the way you approach your guitar playing and music and
holy cats, that's absolutely spot on. It's a direct analogy. Because making good coffee is like preparing for a proficiency exam.
and very timely that you say that because this will come
it,
out in the
it
summer,
just
but
just happens to be this,
it
but
happens to be that time, but very true.
the thing that I always like to be able to work out with students is that a lot of guys have a phobia about doing the proficiency or what's sometimes called the final guitar exam, whatever you want to call it. It's been called various times. It's the final that's half of your grade in the guitar department at Berklee for your private lesson. And it's a really important thing to be able to make it organic. Like, making good coffee, you got to start with good ingredients. And when you have a good machine to be able to play those ingredients, that's when things come together and they work. The thing about, proficiencies is that, it kind of gets a bad rap because it's something that a lot of people put off to the end of their studies. They wait till the end of the semester. They got all these projects doing. They're doing this arranging project and writing out all these horn parts and blah blah blah. And you're kind of cramming at the last minute to be able to put things together, which is really a shame because when you learn the proficiency material so that you can make it organic to your playing, then that's where things really go in another direction. So like making good coffee, you got to have, proper equipment, and you have to be able to start with a good coffee product to be able to make your coffee. No matter how you like it. My wife likes cappuccino, so I foam up the milk for her. I just drink it black, no sugar. That's the way I like my coffee. But there's definitely a parallel to the proficiency thing. Could I show you an example?
I would love that.
All right, cool.
Please do. This is fantastic.
All right, I'm gonna grab a little Git Piglet here.
Yep. And for those of you who are listening, Mark's grabbing his beautiful instrument.
This is a hand carved guitar by John Buscarino. Just recently got this instrument, still breaking it in. Still trying to find the middle C, but every once in a while I get lucky.
I love that, man.
Yeah, it's in there. Well, you got to have a little humor in this stuff. That's also another thing that's really important because your coffee is not going to come out exactly right every single time, but you have to be able to keep trying and you got to keep working at things. So what I'm thinking is, say you're a level 2 student and you're working on your triad arpeggios. When I talk about organic, I'm talking about finding a way that feels natural to be able to play something. And I'll bet about 95% of this all started out by learning a pentatonic or a blues scale, right? And you do a blues scale. Now you would use that kind of sound, over an A7 chord, get a little funky. You got like that kind of vibe going on, and you're playing your blues scale, right? Those are the sounds that we associate, with that kind of action, right? But you're in your level 2 proficiency, and the guy says, "Okay, Billy Bob Thornton, play me an A diminished triad, 2 octaves, man." And first of all, I see some guys will be able to nail it down. Some guys are trying to think about dots. See, I try to sing it and also be able to organize it in terms of where it's coming from. Like, for instance, when you play a pentatonic, that's great for any kind of minor type of sound. If you play a 2-octave minor arpeggio, it's right there. If you make it into a seventh, you can add the seventh to that. And when you make it into a diminished, it's kind of like playing a blues scale where you got that flat 5. And then what I do with that is, like, because you would use a blues, kind of sound over maybe a dominant. That kind of stuff is real natural. So the diminished shape can actually be kind of derived from a blues scale because it's got a flat 3 and a flat 5, you know. So what you're doing, see, that's very close. If you play the blues scale and then you play the diminished chord, and I like this skip, I'm going 1 flat 3 5, and then 1 flat 3 and the flat 5, and then I skip up to the top string. You could play it, so that you finish it up on the second string, but I like it in a block because that's what a blues scale feels like. So now if you want to turn that like into a Michael Brecker or a kind of John Scofield lick, think about, the way that diminished chords work. And if you were moving things in minor thirds, like if I take that diminished idea and I take the top part of it and move it like a diminished, so it's down a minor third. And if I want to flam that third in there, I mean, that's kind of like the way that a diminished chord is moving like this in minor thirds. So now I'll put that little third in there. And that's how stuff starts working. So you see, you're making an improvisational idea out of something organic that you're supposed to be able to know and do anyway. It becomes a lot more fun when you turn it into fun instead of it being something that, like, oh, I got to do this thing, man, and I'm putting my fingers on these dots, sing it. I got the A today. That's good. That's like my high note. Thank God I don't smoke cigars anymore, man, because, like when I was doing that, I could only get up to like maybe a G. But
I love that.
yeah. So you see, now if you start looking at that raw ingredient, I mean, that's just like an ingredient that you're going to turn into coffee. You got to grind those beans, right? Mm-hmm. So you got this little thing on top here, the second octave. You can work with that and then start using it like the diminished. But now think about the melodic motion, because the melodic motion from one structure to the next, coming out of like kind of diminished ideas, moving up in minor thirds like we all do. Now you have the direction that goes from the bottom up of each structure. And then you could play it backwards, top down. You can go one up and one down. See, these are the basic 4 melodic motions. So, one up and one down, then one down and one up. So that's just the basic structure. If you put a little bit of accoutrement in there, like, flaming that third. And then if you wanted to see, like thinking about that diminished scale, you got a diminished scale that's running up on one line. So now you got this. That's like Michael Brecker and John Scofield. And you got the 4 different melodic motions. So one can go up, then down,
Mark, you know what's awesome about all that is you could consider the diminished as the gateway, right? It's the
Yeah,
gateway. It's always that gateway you get into to really sounding like jazz. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
I love what you're talking about because you're taking something that's so, I mean,
Good coffee beans.
good coffee beans, but tying that to the blues, which is really, I mean, really so many of us, that's why we play the guitar, because we love the blues. And I think sometimes our students come in and then they're like, oh, jazz, that's scary or something. But so I love what you're talking about in terms of relating this to, oh, blues. I love the blues. I know about the blues. I know the blues scale. And now what you just showed in about, 5 minutes there is opening up that whole gateway to harmony, jazz harmony, and taking away the fear factor of it, right? It's right there and you hear it around that flat five and stuff. That's awesome. That's
You
great.
got it. I mean, that opens the door to harmony too, because you learn these chord grips as we call them. So maybe you're doing a 13 flat 9 in level 2 too. That can move symmetrically, even though it won't be the four tones inverted. As it goes through minor thirds like the diminished chord does, every note belongs to that diminished scale. And there's different ways of being able to organize this. Like when I was a kid, I was lucky enough to be doing lessons with Joe Pass. And who hooked me up with Joe Pass was Joe Negri. So Cheryl, do you know the story behind Joe Pass and Joe Negri?
No, but I'd love to hear, and I'd love to hear about your experiences with Joe Pass. That's
Can,
amazing.
can
And
I?
I'll see if I can tie them together. Go ahead, Kim.
I want to say to the people listening who don't have a reference point for Joe Negri, he is an incredible jazz guitarist that Mark and Cheryl studied with in Pittsburgh. And if you were a kid growing up in the 70s and 80s, he was the handyman on the Mr. Rogers show. But he's an incredible jazz guitar player. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as a reference point for some of the people who might not get that name right away.
Yeah, and also any Pittsburgher, he was a local TV celebrity back when they had local TV. And so he hosted shows, and it was, if there was someone hip in town, he'd have them on his show. And he also did the little kids show with the castle. What was that called?
Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood.
Yeah,
No, he did a Sunday show with little kids, and he'd play a diminished chord like that, and he'd do the name game, and he'd say, I see Kim, I see Mark, I see. So Pittsburgh has this richness of this guitar tradition. You could go in any guitar store in Pittsburgh. If you play diminished chords, someone will go, that's one of them Joe Negri chords.
Oh, Joe was the man, the most working jazz guitar player and everything else in Pittsburgh, man. And a super gentleman.
Still is.
Yeah, man, he's just unbelievable.
So yeah, I want to know about this little story with Joe and Joe.
Well, I'll give you a little background here. I mean, just cut me off if I start rambling, okay? I still have to tie this together to the Joe Pass West Coast, diminished type of thing, which you guys will like. But what happened was Joe Pass grew up in Johnstown after his family moved from Brunswick, New Jersey. Like when he was 9 years old, his dad took a job in a steel mill in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is about 40 miles outside of Pittsburgh, famous for the flood of 1936 or some year around there, the Johnstown flood. The locals remember that.
Well, I will reveal that I was born in Johnstown Hospital, General
Oh,
Hospital.
yeah, man.
It's other claim to fame, maybe not.
Degrees of separation. If they knew what a star they were getting in that little hospital, holy cats, man. Go dig that. Isn't that something? Well, anyway, Joe grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So as he started getting to be, a better player, he started gravitating toward gigs in Pittsburgh. So that being the neighboring, large city that had some, music happening. So he hooked up with a piano player named Bobby Negri, and Bobby Negri was Joe Negri's brother. Good piano player, and they were a little bit older than Joe Negri. Just like those extra 5 years. I mean, when you're a kid, that makes all the difference in the world, man. Like a senior versus a ninth grader, man. That's a gigantic, like, difference in years, to that age group. So anyway, Joe Pass is playing, gigging with Bobby Negri, and he said that, them both being of Italian extraction, that they would always hang out at Joe Negri and Bobby Negri's mom, Italian, woman that made all kinds of great pastas and meatballs and the gravy and the whole 9 yards of the Italian thing. So, it's like before the gig, you'd get together over at Mama Negri's house, and, you do a feed, and then you maybe play the gig. So these guys were friends, and young Joe Negri saw Joe Pass, many times hanging out and just, being a part of the familia, which was really cool. That's how they got to know each other. And then later on, they stayed in touch. And once upon a time, I guess like when I was around 18 or 19, Joe Pass was doing a seminar that a lot of guys, in the jazz guitar world were starting to do back then. Barney Kessel was doing them, Howard Roberts was doing them, and Joe Pass. And so Joe Negri arranged for me to go to this master class at the Silver Slipper in it was Charlie Bird's club in Silver something or other, Maryland. Not Silver Lake. I'm
Silver Spring.
Silver Spring. That's it. You got
Yeah.
it. So I mean, he had a club there, and Joe rented the space, and they did a thing. So anyway, Joe was not really super strong on theory. I mean, he had some ideas, and he would, kind of spout off some stuff, but he was really just into playing. He had a fabulous ear, and he could hear anything, and it was just, ridiculous the kind of things that he could do. So, anyhow, we got to the session, and there were about 30 guys at this little seminar masterclass thing. And, you know, Joe fielded some questions like, some guy said, "Hey, Joe, what do I do with the Dorian scale?" And Joe would take a big tug on his cigar and go, "Dorian Schmorian, who wants to come up and play a tune?" So, me being the precocious little punk that I was, I raised my hand and I went up and I played. And, it was probably god awful. I'm sure that he was like, biting his tongue and, really suffering. But, we got done. And then I looked at the other guys and I said, "Man, you guys should come up and play." And they're going, "No, you keep playing." And so Joe and I played like 10 tunes. It was like really weird. I mean, he's a real saint for putting up with that because it must have been freaking awful. But anyway, he was totally cool. And then afterwards, I hit him up for lessons, and he actually never charged me for lessons ever. I always brought him a good box of cigars, you know, as a kind of exchange. And I ran into a guy in the past few years. He was a teacher in New York that was teaching one of my students that we had in common. And so I gave this guy Joe a call because we both have some D'Acquisto guitars, which are a really fine handmade instrument. From Jimmy D'Acquisto. And he turned out, that he knew Joe too. And he remembered hearing about some kid from Pittsburgh that used to pay for his lessons with a box of cigars. Really wild, man. 6 degrees of separation. See what happens there, Johnstown?
I love that. I want to take a second to tie all of this great story in with the really cool thing you did
Okay.
relating coffee to the proficiencies.
Okay.
I want
Well,
everybody to hear this though. I mean that you are making connections between everything. And I think it's just important to put a little point on that point that the materials that you use on the guitar are foundational. If you internalize what's in the
that's right.
proficiency, then your applications could be endless. Then you already have this foundation. You have this internalized foundation, so you can go sit with someone who's a master and they could say, "Oh, that thing that you can do with no problem, that you could do all day long, that arpeggio from level 2, guess what? check this out. It becomes this, it becomes this, it becomes this. And if you know it, then you have the key. And then you work on the application of it. And
Absolutely.
and then you also take that foundational knowledge and that curiosity about what can all this stuff do into meetings you have either by chance or through your teachers or through, that's how you end up sitting with masters of the instrument, just because you are curious and you're prepared and you're willing to learn. I think all of everything you said is a great blueprint for people who are thinking about, like, how do I approach this? And what I love about it, I'll say, as a person who is a classical musician and had classical training and then comes to the proficiencies not having seen them, it's like when I look at them, I'm like, oh wow, this is like a blueprint of the fretboard. And if I internalize this and the way it's presented, then I don't feel like an outsider to style that isn't my home.
And in a sense, there's styles, but there's just organic, coffee beans to be able to start out with.
Right.
I mean, no matter what kind of thing that you're possibly into, like materials that you work on to be able to get your language together are universal everywhere. I mean, you can have a really kind of strange guitaristic thing, like if you're doing that beginning of the Villa-Lobos third prelude, right? And you got this drone. When you're playing that intro, I mean, it's a guitaristic thing. It's seconds with a drone underneath. But it ends up in a C major seventh chord and a C major arpeggio. And then it's taken what would be normally like a James Brown kind of ninth chord. So you got like that kind of vibe. But he's taken the ninth chord, instead of doing it like that, he's playing it with 4 fingers. He takes one finger and puts it on the top and plays the B open. So you get this very strange, mysterious chord. And then he does a sequence and lands on a big F sharp bar chord, right? And what that is ninth chords moving in minor thirds like a diminished chord would move. And then you got a few passing notes from the scale, and it's all over a drone, then a sequence before it goes on to and again there's a James Brown chord, and like we might do in a proficiency, like a G7th arpeggio with a little Meet George Jetson. Meet George Jetson.
Oh gosh, go to the next.
And then, the second part is a whole different animal, but it's all put together by the glue of these things that are universal between styles: jazz, classical music, funk, and hip hop things. It's all related, the same way that you would take like those diminished chords I was playing and, just moving the old silent movie kind of, tremolo piano thing, man. So you could take any chord that has diminished qualities and you can move those, and then they can be inverted, drop 2s, drop 3s, and it can move by scale. I got that off a Johnny McLaughlin record called Johnny McLaughlin, Electric Guitarist.
You know, I want to say something about the Villa-Lobos because people might not realize this.
Which
So,
I probably butchered. Sorry.
no, it was beautiful the way you played it. Villa-Lobos wrote the five preludes for classical guitar in 1940. Okay, so 1940, before a lot of the music that you're referencing, that you're saying, oh, this is in this James Brown thing. This was so far before. He wrote it for classical guitar, nylon string acoustic classical guitar. And that particular prelude, the subtitle of it is a tribute to Bach.
Really?
Right? And so, yeah, there's like different ones for the different players. There's like little subtitles, there's little dedications, right? So, what that says to me, I mean, first of all, every time I play or listen to his music for guitar, it's hard to imagine that he was not in our more modern time. You know, like when you play the preludes or when you play the etudes, you're like, this man never heard rock guitar,
Yeah.
right? And yet everything in there is the precursor to it. And why? Because all of those shapes, as you're saying, all of the voicings, they are consistent. They're consistent vocabulary. They're foundations for all of us. And to me, it's great to hear you play that music because that's a lot of the bridge for me. You know,
Yeah.
it's that music.
Absolutely. But it gets back to that organic quality. I mean, I'll try not to lose the thread on the diminished business, but the next part of that tune, it's actually when you're figuring out how you would finger it, it's actually what we call a soprano pedal. And then it winds up with a little modest drop to D minor 7, and then an A minor drop 3, G7 over A, another A minor, a diminished, so you know how those are being organized, those soprano pedals, that's a harmonic minor scale. So when you put together, it keeps on going right down the scale.
Now, tell the classical guitarists who are listening, how much easier would it be to read and memorize a piece of music if you knew that?
Oh, absolutely.
If you knew your harmonic minor scales from the guitar proficiency and you picked up this prelude and you knew your chords from the proficiency, you could read it in a second.
Absolutely. So when you play, D minor, A minor 7, G7 over A, an A minor 7 chord. These are all standard grips, as the old guys used to call them. You took a grip and you moved it around. That's how people learned a diminished chord. And then you found out later on that those were inversions of those same 4 notes.
Right.
But the way that the guys on the left coast used to play it, and Joe Pass was essentially a left coast player, because he resettled in Hollywood. Well, actually, Northridge is where, he was living when I met him. And, when you take a diminished chord, any tone in the chord can be replaced by a step above. So that's where a lot of these kind of motions come from. So you're playing in the box, and the way that they did it is they took the top 4 strings and then they moved it. So again, you're getting these symmetrical ideas that come from diminished. They're not the same 4 notes exactly like a diminished 7th chord, but they all belong to the same chord scale. And when you study the diminished, you're going to find that the octatonic or 8-tone scale is a combination of the initial diminished, like an A diminished 7th chord, and then another one built a second above it. And this was, long time used in Hollywood for like murder mysteries and suspense type of sounds. But basically, we used to call those high lows in arranging because any low degree of a diminished chord can be replaced with an upper neighbor a step above. So you got a chord like this, you put that on it, and you just find applications for these things that fit into the music, which I think is another really important thing about Joe and Wes and other guys. I mean, Joe told me that when he first moved to New York, that he had one gig a week on Saturday nights. It was a regular gig, and the rest of the time he spent in his little dumpy apartment, like trying to transcribe Bird records, Charlie Parker, and learning repertoire, because what the older guys did is they practiced survival skills. They didn't do the hypothetical thing. Well, you can take this Dorian scale and then you can break it into these triads that are parts. I mean, all that stuff is really cool. I love doing that shit too. Oh, sorry, man. But you have to edit that. You have to edit that out, man.
There's no beeps here. Keep going. Keep going.
No beans, man. But what happens in the end is that they were survival skills. So it's like, if you didn't know any tunes, you couldn't work, man, because there weren't any real books. And you couldn't download a lead sheet for a tune like Stella by Starlight, off the internet, because there wasn't any internet. Right. So it's like you had to learn the tunes, and you had to learn how to be able to hear the tunes and, figure a way of kind of grouping them and typing them together, which is another thing I love to do too. Right. Being able to play bass lines and memorize root motion, because that's how I learned how to, learn changes from a great bass player friend of mine named Ed Felsen. That, when I was a young cat, Eddie taught me how to hear changes, through root progression. So I still do that kind of thing with guys, being able to play a good bass line, I think is really essential, but you got to take a tune and you got to be able to sing the root motion and, be able to organize how you think about the tunes. And then you can, kind of group tunes that have particular qualities of, building block, like a tune that goes between relative major and minor, or, a tune that starts on a 2/7 chord, or a tune that starts on a sharp 4/2 diminished, like Stella. You're in the key of B flat, but it starts out with an E chord.
I always thought of Stella was like, if we don't really have a sports team at Berklee, like you have a sports team and they have a fight song, but I always thought Stella by Starlight would be that song.
Yeah,
that's not a bad idea. So, Mark, this is really great. I want to talk a little bit about your Berklee experience, because obviously you brought all of this training and all of this perspective about really practical things that become the basis for your artistic work. In every way, like learning the instrument, having the foundation to do what you want to do artistically, writing a book for Berklee Press called The Practical Jazz Guitarist. How you're going to work.
Shameless self-promotion, right?
I love it. And how you're going to eat and how you're going to pay your bills and how you're going to work as a musician. But you're also bringing it, all of this depth of experience to your teaching, which now at Berklee has exceeded decades. And
three of them now.
And you've taught jazz students, but you've also taught students that have gone on to careers in popular music. Like I'm thinking specifically the students who later became Imagine Dragons, and many other students. And I think I just wanted to put a point on that idea that this approach really works for everybody.
Absolutely.
And I think some people are surprised over the years. They'll say, "Oh, is Mark White a jazz player?" And it's like, well, yeah, but the way he's going to show you the fingerboard and how to approach everything and the fretboard is going to help you be who you want to be. So, can you talk about a little bit about your just sort of teaching experience and philosophy that you brought to Berklee?
Sure. Well, it definitely is based on kind of practicality because, these are things I've always been a player as far as, my first focus. I mean, that's what I've always wanted to do. Uh, but, I could read okay. So I've ended up doing a lot of theater work and, that you need to be versatile when you're doing theater work. So I found out a really funny thing. Like when I was faced with a lot of new things after you got done with those traditional shows like The King and I and Chorus Line and, Fiddler on the Roof and all that kind of thing. All these, newer musicals started, coming up. So I had to, learn how to be able to really be a good rock guitar player, and be able to play Rent and Seussical and High School Musical and Footloose and all these pieces that you really need a pedal board and a combination of guitars. And then other contemporary things like I played the Adams Family past couple years. That takes five guitars. You nylon string, electric guitar, rhythm acoustic, a steel string guitar, and banjo. I think maybe. So it's like you have to be able to kind of get those things together. And I found that if you learn how to get a tone for a rock thing, then you can get the right inflection and feel. And that's what I've always done. So I have to do that, and I just don't cast aspersions on anybody that wants to get certain aspects of guitar playing together. They don't have to be a jazz guy. It's like for years and years, I did, a lot of fusion stuff. I played a Telecaster for many years. I'm just kind of getting back to my old, bebop roots as I'm getting into a crusty old guy that I am. So I like the arch tops and, it's fun, but I still got, a half a dozen like solid body guitars that, I use and you have to be able to learn how to get the sound of a Les Paul or a Strat or a Tele. And now I'm using all electric guitars that are made by John Buscarino. They're Strat copies. Really, very versatile instrument, and I need that when I'm doing those kind of things because you got to be able to rock out. So first of all, I don't have any problems with any student that wants to learn anything. There's always an aspect that we can get together with their playing, whether it's trying to read, or if you're trying to get proficiency materials together, or if you want to get into contemporary improvisation or composition, it's all interrelated. So, the first rule of thumb for me working with any student is always to be able to do the very best for the student. The student to me is somebody that needs to be nurtured and taken care of in a real particular way. But, you have to be able to look at the situation and sometimes ascertain what a person needs, as well as kind of towing the line and getting certain things together. Just like Joe Pass playing the tunes, that's how he worked, and you need to get that craft work together to be able to organize the fingerboard. So no matter which way you look at it, there's always an element that you can relate to. It doesn't have to be style specific, because I like any great guitar player, whether it's a guy like Danny Gatton playing his redneck jazz, as he called it, or a fusion guy like Mike Stern, or, any number of the amazing faculty that are on the guitar department at Berklee. I mean, holy cats, these guys, man. My pal Joe Stump, my martini buddy, Steaks and Martinis. For years, we've been hanging out and doing stuff. I was at Joe's wedding, it's like, there's nobody that's got better hands on the planet than that guy playing guitar, man. I mean, he's just phenomenal. So much to learn. And he gave me one of my favorite, little kind of things about myself. He said that, Whitey, you sound like Pat Martino on crack when you play. And I like that, man. I always
There you
remembered it.
go.
I
We can
thought that,
talk about later what that translates to, but I love that.
yeah, remember now, guys, that drugs is for dopes.
Right.
So we're not doing any dope here,
And
okay?
when we say cats and guys, we mean the girls and the women too, and
We mean
everybody.
everybody. It's all inclusive. Cats is non-denominational and it has no gender affiliation. I mean, if you probably, saw my thing, it should say he, his, cats,
I love that.
as far
I
as
love
the
that.
pronouns, because
That
it's generico.
Ian, this completely feeds into a question that you usually ask, and so I'm going to hand that over to you.
Yeah, so there's a question that we ask basically everybody on Coffee Talk. Get a lot of interesting answers. Um, what's something that you feel like students should be asking that might not be on their radar? Something they might not think to ask?
Hmm. That's a good question. Um, I would think that a good starting answer would be you need to think about where your career is going to take you. There's a lot of difference in the time now from when I was a guitar player, young guy trying to be able to get stuff together, still trying to play this freaking thing. But I get the four chord every once in a while. At least I got this, pretty much together. But seriously though, I mean, you really you got to look about diversity, what you need to be able to work and interface with other musicians. I think that's really important, and I think that that's one of the most important aspects of Berklee. People form relationships here that last for years. I mean, like my old pal Victor Mendoza called me from Spain this morning. I mean, Victor and I have toured the world together. We played concerts in Portugal, on islands in Spain, and all kinds of gigs around Boston. And I mean, you name it. Plus, Victor's dad was a great guitar player too, Antonio Mendoza. Uh, he's no longer with us, but he's a great spiritual force. And that's an association of players that you meet at a school. And whether you're faculty or whether you're a student, you're going to build these lifelong friendships that are going to help you to be able to work. And I think that that's a really important thing that you have to ask yourself. What are you trying to accomplish with your playing? Some people just want to work on being a badass guitar player and getting their skills together because they've set aside a particular time and place to be able to do that. Every great guitar player needs to be able to do that at some point in their career. You just got to sit down, and as Wes Montgomery said about Django Reinhardt, there's a guy that just sat down and played a whole lot of guitar. Now when you translate, that means the guy was practicing like crazy. So, whether you kind of look at it in that folkloric type of language or whatever, you got to figure, are you trying to be able to work? Or are you trying to be able to be a gigging guitar player? Or are you going to be versatile that you can do theater work and learn how to read music and be a very skilled musician, not just a guitar player? Which is a really important thing that I try to impart on my students. I mean, I think that grids and tablature and anything that you can learn from is all really good, but I'm a really big advocate of being able to link together your Berklee studies. Like you take in harmony class, right? When I see a guy that comes in, he studied all these secondary dominants and all these chords that he can do and all this stuff, and he's still playing, comping chords like bar chords, and that's his chord language on guitar. Well, he says, well, the other stuff, that's what I do for class. It's like, no, man, you have to be able to make that organic. What you learn how to hear and play is the same thing. And it's like, you got to be able to put that together. Sing what you play, sing what you hear, and be able to use harmonies and understand how things work. So that's one of the things that I think a student should really be thinking about, with their Berklee career, is that, what direction do you want to go, and what are you doing at this particular time? So I don't know. Does that answer that question at all, Ian?
Yeah.
The deadly Ian Steed question.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I like what you said, actually connected to some things that some other folks said, where you were like, this can't just be, esoteric knowledge. Like what you play is what you hear, and what you hear should be what you play. And
Absolutely.
that's so real. I mean, it seems almost too obvious when you say it, but it's like that's like some real skill that like takes developing and
Absolutely.
connecting a lot of this. Because I mean, at Berklee, you just get like right now people are taking their finals. This is going to come out after finals, but still, like, people get overwhelmed. I mean, you guys went to Berklee, like it's like you just get like all this information just dumps right in front of you. And like, people talking to students right now was in the office, and they're just how are you? They just be like, oh man, got a lot of stuff. And that's actually good, because then
Yep.
you can start to sort of explore how you work that into your guitar playing, because
Sure.
like nobody really does it quite the same, right? Of all
No,
the folks, all
it's
these
the
guitar
beauty of
players,
it.
so many people are applying this in kind of their own way, or finding their own way of like mining that information and getting something out of the guitar from it.
That's exactly where it's at. And nothing breaks my heart worse than when I'm seeing a student doing a final exam, and you say, "Hey, Billy Bob, play me this chord," and you see the guy's hands are like twitching around, trying to remember the shape of the dots. I mean, those things are cool, but it's like I say, "Hey, Billy Bob, play me a G major 7," and I see like the twitching thing, and it's like all these getting real frantic and all that. And I say, "Hey, Billy Bob, do you know a G major 7?" He goes, "Sure." And he goes, "Bing." I go, "Sing the fifth of that chord," and he goes, "Do ba da da." Okay, make it sharp 5. Do da. There's your chord. Want to make it flat 5? Bing. Use your theory skills and your training to be able to put your guitar playing together. And
Yeah.
then
I
when you
I
get
want
all
to
that
chime in.
uniformity, that's when things start coming together more, where you can really start hearing things.
I think you're right, Mark, because some of what you're saying is you want to play what you hear, but then it's okay to play stuff you can't hear yet, and
Sure.
and let your hands lead your ears.
You
Like
have
you,
you
you,
have to learn.
you have to get in there. You have to jump in there, and I love what you're saying and the connection. And what I was thinking is, we usually start with this question, but I think it's a good last question for you as we're coming to the end of this really cool hour.
Fun flies when you play in time.
It's true. The question was about people's first days at Berklee, and I'm wondering if instead of answering that question, if there's something that's stayed consistent for you, whether it's a feeling you have when you're at Berklee or an experience you have at Berklee, like is there something that's the same for you? Like on your first day you saw this and felt this, and on tomorrow when you go in, you'll
It's
feel
all
the same way.
it's all the great players. I mean, that to me is the most consistency thing. you know People can come and go, administrators and everybody else, but the one thing that is always consistent is the level of musicianship of the guys that teach at this college and the students that attend this college. I mean, that has always just been, an amazing pleasure and a joy to be able to tap into and to celebrate. And that for sure has never changed about this school. I mean, there are people that can say whatever they want, but if you're a really playing musician, that there are other people around here that will always fill that bill, regardless of whatever they're into. And I think that that's really important for a young student too, is like keep your mind open. Don't just get into like, well, I'm a rock guy or I'm a jazz guy or I'm a funk guy. It's like taking the big picture. You want to be able to see everybody, and there are so many fabulous people here at the school: fingerstyle guitarists, rock guys, cats that play country stuff. I mean, it's like you pick a genre, it's represented at this school, and it was always like that. There have always been really terrific students and faculty here. So I think that that would be maybe the most consistent factor for me.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's really, really cool to hear. Cheryl Bailey, what's your final thought as we're wrapping up this pod coffee?
Well, Mark, thanks for coming on. And anyone who hung out with Joe Negri's right on in my book. But
I got his guitar hanging up on the wall right over there.
I know. We got to hang and play and check that out. But I really love really what you're saying, everything that you shared with us about the universality of just musicianship and the guitar, right? And that, and also what you just kind of said there was like having that openness and not saying, well, I'm a rocker, so I want to, I'm a jazzer, I don't do that. But that you showed just in the first 15 minutes when we were hanging out that all of these skills make the whole picture. So thanks for sharing that. And also, relating it to stuff that we know, like a blues scale. We
Yep.
know that, we love that. And how do we expand on that, make that a foundation to just build on? So it was
Yeah,
very
that
cool.
little old pentatonic scale, man. When you play that up a half a step,
You get fired.
All right, nobody's getting fired today, and we're gonna stay and hang a little longer. But before we do that, Ian, what's your final thought?
Yeah, I mean, you got like pretty general and universal, but as you just did, you also get really specific. So I think students are going to be going back, rewinding, and getting more out of this. It's almost like a lesson, you know,
oh, I
some
hope so.
serious Mark White lesson that we're all getting here.
I mean,
Yeah, true to my heart, Mark. You played Villa-Lobos, and you played it so beautifully, and
you
I
too
think
kind.
you showed the deep respect that is so. I hope well known in our department for all styles and approaches, and all of the musicians in our department, all the students and faculty, and what everybody brings to this instrument in their unique way. I think you
It's amazing.
encapsulated that in a short hour in a really
Absolutely.
beautiful way.
And I'm so grateful too over the years to have sent an army of young students out there that, so many of them are involved in really high end professional stuff. And I'm really, proud of that, like Daniel Sermon, that those guys met in my eclectic electric band. I needed a drummer, I needed a bass player. I found Dan Platzman and I found Ben McKee, and those guys played for the first time in my band at school.
Beautiful.
So they kind of credit me as being the origins of the beginning of Imagine Dragons. But then they stayed for 5 semesters. They were there for almost 3 years. They're such great students. And I used to take those guys out on, we would do like benefits for the Boston Food Bank and, different kind of things like that. They were such really great guys. And they were really great jazz and fusion players too. So if you really get your stuff together, you can, do any direction that you want to try to accomplish. Don't box yourself in. I
Right.
mean, it's like there is so much talent here to be able to draw from. Every one of the people in the guitar department is just, top notch. You couldn't find a better faculty or more diversified faculty, on the planet. And, I think that, talking about the word diversity too in these times where, there's so much unrest and weird political issues and all the rest of that, which I certainly won't go into. But, you find a bunch of really caring people that transcend color and religion and styles and, being typified. These are just good people, man. They're good people that know how to interact with other people. And that is always what a good musician does before anything else. You got to be a good human or you'll never actually play good music, I don't think. I mean, I guess there's some exceptions to that rule, but I try to be open and human in the way that I approach music and the people I work with. And I celebrate that in others too. So things can only get better, right?
That's right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you for everything that you do on the faculty, and thanks for hanging with us today.
Oh,
And
thank you, Kim and Cheryl and Ian. I mean, three people that I really love and cherish that, really nurture the guitar department. And things have never run, so smoothly. And, I got nothing but praise. So thanks for having me today. And it was really great to be able to spend a little time with all you guys that might tune in later. I hope you pick an idea or two out that might be useful.
well, thank you, Mark, and thanks everyone for listening. Thank you, Ian Steed. Thank you, Cheryl Bailey. Coffee cheers to the three of you here, and coffee cheers to everyone watching and listening. And we'll be back again soon with you for another coffee talk.
Salute.